They were reported missing long before they were reported alive. One day, the letters stopped. Then the telegram arrived, short, official, empty of detail. Missing in action. No location, no explanation, no timeline. For families, those 3 words created a space where hope and fear lived together. Missing meant not dead. Missing meant maybe alive somewhere. Missing meant waiting. And waiting became its own kind of war. During World War II, tens of thousands of soldiers vanished behind enemy lines. Some were killed, some escaped, and some were captured, quietly, suddenly, without witnesses. Prisoners of war did not disappear loudly. There were no headlines when they were taken, no confirmation sent home. For months, sometimes years, families lived inside uncertainty. A wife learned how to read silence. A mother memorized the sound of the mail truck. Children grew older without answers. Behind barbed wire, life continued, but not in ways that could be described later. Camps were places where time lost meaning, days blurred, names were replaced by numbers, identity was reduced to survival. Men learned quickly that speaking could be dangerous. Asking questions could be punished. Remembering too much could break you. Silence became protection. When the war began to end, gates opened quietly. Prisoners were released in groups that felt unreal. Men stepped out, thinner, slower, older than their years. Some smiled, some didn't. They were alive, but something had changed. The journey home was not a celebration. Medical checks, debriefings, interviews conducted in small rooms by people who asked questions without emotion. What did you see? What did they say? What did you tell them? Some questions were followed by instructions. You will not discuss this. This information is classified for national security. Others did not need to be told. The words simply wouldn't come. When they returned home, families expected stories. Neighbors expected relief. Communities expected gratitude. But many men returned, carrying a silence they could not explain. They hugged their wives, but did not meet their eyes for long. They held their children as if unsure they were real. At dinner tables, conversations paused when someone asked, "What was it like?" The answer was always the same. "I don't want to talk about it." Some said it calmly, some said it sharply, some never said anything at all. Families assumed it was pain, trauma, something time would fix. But time did not fix silence. For some, the silence was enforced. POWs, who had been interrogated, who had witnessed enemy methods, who had survived certain camps, were warned, sometimes formally, sometimes quietly, that speaking could endanger others. For others, the silence came from somewhere deeper. How do you explain starvation without shame? How do you describe fear that never leaves? How do you tell someone about the moments you survived when others didn't? Many didn't try. They returned to jobs. They built homes. They lived normal lives on the surface. But inside, the war continued. Nightmares arrived without warning. Sudden noises triggered reactions no one understood. Some men avoided crowds. Others avoided sleep. A few avoided everyone. Children grew up sensing something missing. They knew their father had been in the war. They knew he had been captured. But the years in between were blank. A hole in the story. Teachers taught World War II as victory and sacrifice, medals, battles, dates. None of it explained the man who sat silently in their living room at night. The government offered little guidance. There were no public discussions of trauma, no language for what these men carried, and so silence became tradition, passed from father to son, from memory to nothing. Some POWs tried to speak years later, to friends, to journalists, to historians. Many stopped halfway through, unable to continue. Words failed them where survival had not. Others never spoke at all. They carried entire histories inside themselves until the end of their lives. And when they died, their families realized how much had been left unsaid. Boxes were opened, old documents discovered, camp identification cards, notes written in shaky handwriting, evidence of lives lived in captivity that had never been shared. Suddenly, the silence had weight. These men had returned home physically, but parts of them never did. The gates closed behind them with a sound that seemed louder than any explosion they had survived. Inside, the world had rules that did not exist outside. Time was measured in roll calls and rations. Conversations were carefully chosen, gestures weighed for meaning. Every eye was watching. Every word was recorded, sometimes by guards, sometimes by fear itself. Men learned to disappear without leaving evidence, to eat, to sleep, to survive without drawing attention. Names were stripped, numbers were assigned, identity became negotiable. The silence was everywhere. Conversations were few. Laughter, when it occurred, felt forbidden. Tears were private. Dreams were dangerous if spoken aloud. Some tried to preserve memory in secret. A scrap of paper tucked in a boot. A smuggled pencil hidden in a mattress. Notes written in code, folded so tightly they could almost disappear. These were small rebellions against erasure, against a world that said, "You will not exist here as you were before." Each day was a test. Some prisoners survived the violence of guards. Others survived hunger, disease, and despair. And all survived the invisible rule that said they must speak only what could be proven, or nothing at all. Letters home were rare. When allowed, they were heavily censored. Locations removed. Details stripped. Even a few innocuous words could be crossed out in black ink, leaving hollow spaces where memory had tried to escape. And still, families waited. Mothers and wives memorized every pause, every half-word. Children held hope in the gaps, counting weeks, months, years. Inside the camps, men calculated survival the same way. Not battles, not strategy, but silence, compliance, endurance. There were moments of humanity's small victories that could not be recorded. A shared loaf of bread, a whispered joke in a hallway, a hand offered to lift a fallen comrade. These moments were invisible, priceless, fleeting. Some prisoners formed bonds that would last a lifetime. But speaking of them after the war was almost impossible. Stories that might reveal names, locations, or operations were locked behind fear, training, and habit. The war outside ended before the war inside had a conclusion. Prisoners were freed, the gates opened. Some were handed over to authorities. Some simply walked away, released into a world that had moved on without them. And when they returned, nothing felt like it had before. Celebrations, parades, and medals surrounded them. But the invisible weight of the barbed wire, the silence, the unseen suffering remained. Some tried to speak, tried to explain the things that had happened, but words failed. The human mind struggles to convey events that break its limits. The eyes remember more than the tongue can say. The heart holds more than paper can record. And so, silence persisted. In quiet homes across the country, families welcomed back men who were alive, but changed. Fathers who no longer laughed the same way. Husbands who held their wives differently. Brothers who stared across rooms and said nothing of what they had endured. Some men took to walking alone at night. Some avoided crowds. Some became experts at conversation about anything else, but never about what truly mattered. Psychologists would later call it PTSD, but at the time, there was no language for it. There was only the understanding that some things could not be shared. That the truth of survival sometimes must be carried alone. Decades later, historians would uncover fragments, memoirs, camp lists, rare photographs, bits of information that hinted at lives lived in silence. But the full stories remained largely untold. And the men themselves, the ones who returned, carried not just memories of battle, but of the invisible chains of secrecy imposed upon them by captors, by the government, and sometimes by themselves. Because even freedom could not erase the rule of silence learned behind barbed wire. Even survival came with a price, and the cost of keeping quiet, of returning without explanation, echoed long after the war had ended through decades of birthdays, weddings, deaths, and ordinary days, silently shaping the lives of those who loved them. When the trains arrived and men stepped onto familiar soil, there was applause, cheers, flags waving in the wind, journalists taking pictures, families crying with relief. And yet, some of those returning soldiers did not hear the clamor. Their ears were tuned to other sounds, the echo of barbed wire, the muffled orders shouted across a yard, the quiet moans of men who had not survived. They were alive, but the war had not left them entirely. At home, life continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Neighbors smiled, children ran, streets buzzed with normalcy. But for these men, normalcy had a hidden layer. They carried experiences that could not be named. Faces, places, conversations, fears, imprinted on memory, impossible to communicate. Words were inadequate. Sometimes they were dangerous. Some attempted to speak anyway. A few sentences, a story here, a hint there. But every time the response reminded them of the world, they had returned to one that could not or would not understand. That's just war talk. You exaggerate. It was a long time ago. Let it go. And slowly, silence took over. Even within families, the men learned to speak around the truth. They told parts of their experiences, but only the safe parts, only what could be shared without consequence. Children grew up believing their fathers had fought, had been brave, had survived. But they never knew the nights when their fathers could not sleep, when nightmares blurred reality with memory, when the weight of unspoken events pressed on their chest. Marriages were forged with love, but under the shadow of absence. Husbands returned, physically whole, but emotionally divided. Conversations that could have built understanding were missing. The past was a locked room, and no key existed. Some men found solace in routines, work, hobbies, friends who had served in similar shadows. Letters to historians, journals kept secretly, memories carved into notebooks, never to be published in their lifetimes. Others withdrew, avoided gatherings, avoided war commemorations, avoided questions that could pierce the fragile barrier they had built around their past. The government, too, remained silent. Classified operations, POW treatment, and security measures meant that official records rarely reflected reality. Decades later, even when documents were declassified, fragments alone hinted at what had occurred. Families, researchers, historians, some pieced together hints, but no narrative could fully capture the lives lived in enforced silence, the sacrifices made, the bravery displayed, the suffering endured mostly invisible to history. And so, these men lived between two worlds, the visible, public life they were allowed to participate in, and the invisible, private life that the war had etched into their being. Some learned to cope with the duality, others never did. The effects rippled across generations. Children sensed the unease. Grandchildren noticed the quiet stories that were never told. Even in old age, some still carried the burden of secrecy. Moments of vivid recall, faces of fallen comrades, the harsh orders, the fear and the hunger, they returned in dreams. Words that could never be spoken pressed against their lips, but remained locked behind the gate of silence. Some found solace only in the knowledge that their survival in itself had been a victory. That returning home, even with silence as a companion, was proof that they had endured the impossible. And when they passed away, families sometimes discovered pieces of their hidden lives' handwritten notes, diaries, faded photographs, small tokens of the years spent in captivity and silence. The fragments told a story that could not be erased, no matter how much the world had attempted to ignore it. For those who returned from the war, the greatest victory was not recorded in medals or honors. It was in surviving, in returning, and in bearing witness to lives that had been almost forgotten. Because history is not only written in textbooks, it is also found in the memories we keep. The stories we choose to share remain silent about, and the silence of those men who came home but could not speak remains a solemn reminder. Some battles are fought long after the war is over. Some wars continue in silence, and some heroes are known only to themselves and the shadows they endured.